This morning sermon was based off of Romans 12, 1 and 2. And so I'll start out by reading those verses. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So that's where we started out this morning. When I was writing this sermon, one of the biggest challenges was how much actually had to be put into this sermon as far as background goes, because this verse, when he starts out, I appeal to you, therefore is referring to the first 11 chapters. And to start writing this sermon, and this sermon is these verses are so theologically dense. One of the commentaries actually said it's probably the most theologically dense verses in the Bible. And I would have to agree with that. I mean, we might be able to find some other ones that are on par with it, but it really is, there's just so much. So in order to write a sermon that people who've never heard the message of Jesus and people who've been lifelong Christians can both get something out of, I found to be a real challenge this week.
So how do you go about the process of actually picking what you would introduce as the context to a verse like that when you're sitting down?
Yeah, it's really broad.
It is. So basically, I start by looking at the commentaries. I listen to some sermons that other pastors have done. I kind of look and see where other people have taken the verses. And then I do something that is just my own personal practice, where I read through the verse a number of times right in a row, and I wait for God to speak to me. I kind of just sit quietly and wait for God to speak to me and pull out what needs to be pulled out of those verses. So for me today, or when I was studying this past week, the word therefore jumped out to me right away. And it seems like a weird word to jump out to you, but therefore referred to the first 1 through 11 chapters. Mm-hmm. And then when I started looking at that, I realized that Paul was really just being a teacher in those chapters. He taught, he was giving the Roman church all of their background, all of this theology, and then this was where he turned into the pastor and where he said, therefore, and he started exhorting the people.
It's a really profound distinction between Paul being the teacher and Paul being the pastor.
Yeah.
I think he, in the rest of his letters to the churches, it sounds more like he's being a pastor and a shepherd and more of a mitigator. A lot of his others are.
A lot of it's just taking care of business. Yeah.
Don't do this.
Problem.
Do
Yes.
this.
Yep. And that's something that we forget about when we start a lot of times diving into Paul's letters. It's that everything that we have he was responding to something that had happened or something that he had heard. Mm-hmm. It's a letter. It's a response. It's not just him saying, this is the way it is, because he felt like saying, this is the way it is. It was, we get the middle of a conversation. And so we've got to always read that with that in mind.
I think we, as Christians, also kind of forget sometimes that each of those is speaking to a particular situation.
Yep.
It's not necessarily covering all situations under the sun. Take this approach. It's in this particular thing. That's what he was addressing.
Yes.
But
yeah. And we can get in, we have to be really careful. That's one of the major obstacles for women in ministry is the interpretation of those verses that are challenging, that sound like women can't be in ministry, the interpretation of those verses as global instead of just responding to a particular problem that church was having.
Yep. But that's a whole
different thing. That's a whole different thing. It's kind of personal for me, though, so kind of I remember it every
next
once in a
week's
while.
sermon.
Yeah, no.
Why is that? Why would that be?
Why would that be? I don't know. I'm not sure.
No, how do you interpret the idea of living sacrifice?
Okay.
'Cause that was something you touched on a little bit in the sermon, but it is such a complex idea.
So what I guess came to me as I was studying, and is so different about a living sacrifice, is a living sacrifice, unlike the other sacrifices, where you'd sacrifice an animal as an atonement for sin. If you are a living, walking being, you're always making mistakes, right? So the sacrifice can never be a complete sacrifice. What we do always has sin in it. Even if we're doing something good for somebody else, sometimes there's self-interest that creeps in. So even in our good actions, our sinful nature still creeps up sometimes. How can that be a sacrifice? The sacrifice was to be pure and spotless. So when we start talking about living sacrifice, you really realize that the only way we can do that is because we are constantly being covered by the blood of the perfect sacrifice. So it makes it so that there's not this like time stamp, like, okay, everything over here is clear, but now, oops, and now what I'm doing isn't going to work out or isn't going to be beneficial. It's not that, because we are constantly being covered by the blood. We have to keep our own sin in mind. And Paul makes that really clear, that he always talks about understanding our own sin. And so we have to keep our own sin in mind, but then we have to walk in the victory that is, we can act and we can be the hands and feet of Jesus, and that our actions can be our living sacrifice. So our actions then are turned into what our sacrifice, our worship is to God.
So it's in the words that pop into my head is it's more about our bond and our relationship, and that's the crux of the sacrifice rather than a transactional process.
Yes.
That the sacrifices before came.
Yep. And it is. It's all about our relationship.
The debt is paid.
Yeah, if we're not walking and talking with God, if we're not constantly aware of that, then how can our actions be God-centric and be that living sacrifice?
I have like 4 directions I want to go at the same time. You just raised an interesting thing with the idea of being a living sacrifice, and the nature of what a sacrifice is. The perfect, without blemish. It sounds almost like it's a call to sanctification. That call to transform and to live as close to that perfection as we can. Because ultimately, if we are called to be a living sacrifice, we have to get rid of all the things that hold us back, all the things that make us imperfect or impure, in order to obtain that realistically title.
Well, and that's where transformation comes into play, because the more we practice, and it's practice. We are practicing walking in the footsteps of Jesus. But the more we practice, the more we are transformed into the likeness of Christ. The more, my favorite theologian that talks about actually being transformed into the likeness of Christ is Bonhoeffer. He does an incredible job of talking about that. But our transformation into the likeness of Christ is based on what we practice, what we bring into our lives. And so that brings that sanctification up, where it's a constant effort on our part. There are some sects of Christianity that believe that you can be fully sanctified while still on this earth. We don't believe that. We believe that, we try to live as close to that as possible, but it's an ongoing process. And that's why I brought up that, when you see that person who's 80 or 90 years old and they are so Christ-like, that didn't happen by accident. It happened because of the practices they put into their lives when they were 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or so on, because that doesn't happen by accident. It's very hard to be formed like that, and it's something we have to work on.
Yeah, and you talked about a minister with how do you create a revival?
Yep, Gypsy
Yeah.
Smith.
you said.
Gypsy Smith. Yep.
Do you want to talk about what he said? Like, how
Yeah.
do you obtain that?
Yeah, the biggest thing that stood out to me on that statement where he was asked, how do you create a revival? And he said, go to your room alone, lock the door, sit down in the middle, draw a circle, and pray for revival to begin within that circle. Those are obviously not literal instructions of how to do this step by
I
step.
don't think it hurt though.
It's probably a good focus point and a good habit to have, but the point that I feel like he was trying to get to was, it is a process, it is a diligence, it is a repeated motion, it is the sitting down and actually focusing on it,
Yeah, the discipline
day in
of
and
it.
day out.
I think another element of that just kind of jumped out to me. We as Christians spend an awful lot of time praying for revival for that person over there because they need it.
Yes.
Or for our country because
Yep.
it's falling apart. Or for, that other denomination over there because they're theologically just not quite right.
Yeah.
You know,
You're gonna be really surprised when they're in heaven right next to us, right?
yeah. Didn't think we were going to have to race the Baptists in heaven to the restaurant.
Yes.
But okay.
There we go.
But revival
I'm like, where were we?
As on earth is
As is heaven.
That's it.
Ouch.
Oh. Now I lost my track.
Now
I was there. Now I'm gone. But no, just the idea that revival has to begin with an inward focus.
Yeah. And
You know,
so
I can't pray for God to affect somebody else,
No.
but I can pray for God to affect me.
I think when we think about revival, the temptation is to think that we want to just experience those feelings that somebody else is responsible for bringing to the table. And I think that gets us into trouble. But like, if we go all the way back to the beginning, if we go all the way back to William Seymour, who is one of the founders of what has become the Assemblies of God Church, the Azusa Street Revival, it's recorded that he prayed 4 hours a day. 4 hours a day just for the infilling of the Holy Spirit.
If you ever wanted to feel bad about yourself,
But that's where revival starts. It's not necessarily praying about, and we need to pray about a lot of things. We need to pray about the country. We need to pray about our cities. We need to pray about all of these things. But that's not what brings revival. What brings revival is 4 hours a day saying, God, change me. And if you get enough people in a room who are doing that, you can't help but have revival.
yeah.
No.
And
So we start in 4 hours every day?
We'll start that tomorrow.
I'll set my alarm.
All right.
But no, you also had an analogy of the farmer's field, you know? And our transformation, the fruit of our transformation, just like a farmer's field, isn't just to our benefit; it's to the benefit of everybody around us. So taking that and putting it into the context of a revival of God, let's start revival here in this circle. It puts us to a position where we can be the hands and feet of God. We can be what we are called to be as the church. And in doing that, affect everybody around us.
Yep.
But we can't look at a different farmer's field and, be like, here, let that be it. No, like, I'm going to do the work. I'm going to do the diligence. I'm going to plant the crops. I'm going to, weed.
Yep.
So that way it can be a blessing and benefit through me.
Yeah.
It's the what's the word I'm looking for? It's the taking responsibility, I guess, and that's where the discipline, kind of ties in with it also.
Well, and,
And
that's,
it's-
sorry.
It's important that you have your field and you steward your field and make sure it's producing fruit and as a benefit to others, because it also is the next person down the field. To really hit the metaphor on the head, you're growing green beans and I'm growing potatoes.
Just
And-
saying, mine's healthier, but that's okay.
Mine's tastier.
That's not the point.
But each person brings a different role and a different job and a different piece to it. And while it's important that it starts somewhere and starts internally, and you yourself manage your own revival, it is a benefit to those around you who are also.
Well,
Do
if
you
we
have
want
their
to,
own-
Which then
Rival.
brings it to what you were saying earlier of if you get everybody in a room that's in that same position, that is pursuing God in that way, that's when you really start to see, the revival happen and take place.
well, and if we want to continue to torture the metaphor, we can
Perfect.
talk about how if this farmer doesn't take care of their field and doesn't take care of their irrigation system, it means water might not get to this field over there. And there is a community aspect of this where we are responsible to take care of our own fields because other fields rely on us too. And then we start talking about the body of Christ and we start talking about that.
Oh, that's a chain reaction.
Yeah, how do we have another hour? I'm not sure. All right. I think that anything else on the sermon?
I hope not.
Okay.
A lot.
Yeah,
There's a lot of other
lot,
things on
but-
this sermon. I think one of my favorite things to do with this sermon was actually use the metaphor of the oasis in the desert and how we have a choice to live in the oasis as our reality or live in the desert as our reality. And we can go to that source of living water. But the world always wants to pull us back and tell us that the desert is our reality. When our reality, we are heirs to that fountain. And that's our reality. But we have to work. And that's where the transformation comes in and the disciplines come in. We have to actually practice. We have to practice becoming more Christ-like so that we don't get distracted by what's in the desert and that we're just there.
I mean, you look at the early church who, the letters and the gospel and everything was written to. When they gained access to those letters, it was a huge ordeal.
Yes.
We walk around, with the Bible in our pocket, and maybe we read it, maybe we don't. But I don't know. Our favorite team might be playing, so we might be watching that.
Yep.
Like, we're surrounded with the distractions that are the desert, but we just don't prioritize the oasis, like you said.
Yeah. Yep. And going there. And that's one of the focuses that we have at Bedrock Church is that we are going to be working and we continue to work to help people develop the habits that bring them closer to Jesus and that make them a disciple of Christ. Because it's not just sitting in the pew and learning things. It's not just working in the cafe. It's not doing that. That is not the things that bring us closer into relationship with God. What brings us closer into relationship with God is practicing the practices that Jesus did. And so we work really hard to create an environment where we can do that.